Welcome. This video interview is one of a series of 7. My name is Chris Heald. Throughout these videos, I will be interviewing John Beckford. During the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2020, John and I wondered why cybernetics and its learning about systems has not played a greater role in the global response to the pandemic. We concluded that cybernetics was not as accessible as it should be. So we decided to conduct these interviews. John is currently president of the Cybernetics Society and has written extensively on the subject. We are both consultant practitioners who use the ideas in our work. We have known one another and collaborated for approximately 20 years. We have never made videos before. Each one lasts about an hour. The series is in a logical order, but they are also designed to be standalone, so you don't need to watch them in sequence if you choose not to. We have had great fun making these videos, and as Stafford Beer might suggest, we hope you will find them more or less useful. Please feel free to contact either of us. But actually today we've decided that we would like to explore some of the key concepts rather more. And what we're going to do with that, we're going to look, last time we did look quite a lot about purpose and purposeful, but that's one of the 4 things we're going to go back to today. We're going to also look at complexity and how that applies, the adaptive nature of cybernetic model, and what John will talk about as feedback back and forward, and I sort of describe more as the kind of loops that are built into the whole cybernetic way of operating. So for today, that's what we're going to do. And I think we're going to start by diving into the complexity area a bit more.
Hey, thanks,
so,
Chris.
John.
Really interesting starting points. So do you want an explanation of what I think complexity is?
That would be a great place to start.
Okay, so it's a word we use a lot without really articulating what we think we mean by it. So complexity is probably measured best by understanding the interaction between the number of elements in a system and the degree of mobility or activity between those elements. So how many elements are there, and to what extent are they interacting? And obviously the more interaction we've got, the more dynamism there is in the system, the more complex it will be to understand. So we can have large and complex systems that are quite straightforward. So if we take something like I was going to say a 747, these days it would be a 777 or an Airbus. They're very large, very complex systems, but they're linear and deterministic in the sense that given a plan, given a set of instructions, any one of us with an appropriate tool set could reconstruct an aircraft because they're designed to work in a particular way. When we look at organizational or social contexts and think about complexity, we have a different dimension, because we have a situation in which they're non-linear, they're non-deterministic, because their behavior is a function of the interactions of the people, and the people of course are working with different systems, different thinking, different meaning, different interpretations. They no longer have a single plan to work with. So we go from describably complex, a 747, a large systemic artifact, to indescribably complex, a set of interactions between elements of a system, particularly where there are human beings involved and their different interpretations of world. Even this conversation, at the simplest level, has a semantic, a syntactic meaning, which is about the language that we use to talk to each other. But it also has a semantic meaning, which is concerned with not what did I say in terms of the signals I gave, but what did I say in terms of the words I used, what they mean to me, So what I intend to transmit to you and to the rest of the audience, and how you interpret and understand what I've said. And each of those things is informed by us being very different people with different lived experiences, different knowledge, different understanding of language. So what looks on the surface to be straightforward is quite complex. If we get to the level of trying to understand meaning, it becomes indescribably complex, because it's even informed by our moods at the point where we're making the conversation happen.
So complex doesn't it isn't more complex just because of its size. That's one thing I'm hearing you say. You know, scale doesn't necessarily mean more complex. You're talking about the number of elements involved and the kind of interaction between them. And are you saying that once you've got human beings involved, it becomes more complex? Because is that what you were saying in that last example?
Well, yes, because human beings bring their own interpretation of what they're observing, and their values and their beliefs and their experience into the conversation. So they interpret the conversation through, if you like, the lens of their lived experience, the lens of their knowledge. And so what they receive and what we intend to transmit are not necessarily the same thing. So at the level of pure signal, if you like, in information theory, we can use electronic means to move a signal around it and guarantee that what is sent is what is received. What we can't guarantee is that what is meant is what is understood. And that gives a whole different dimension, particularly when one of the common critiques of cybernetics in organizations is very technocratic. And it is, of course, possible to describe an organization using mechanistic language, using mechanistic designs, and say, here is a representation. But when you then say, but that representation is populated by 100 or 200, or in the case of somebody like Walmart, 4.5 million people, then the actual organization is not the thing that you've just described on a piece of paper as a mechanistic system. And its behavior is more about the people and their interactions than it is about the organization chart.
So there was a period, wasn't there, when people described organizations through those kind of mechanistic, you know, I mean, is that fundamentally flawed in cybernetic thinking then, to think about a system in that way and try and look at it mechanically like that?
Stefan Beer talked about organization charts as frozen out of history. It's a kind of description, and a fairly useful description, of a set of hierarchical offices representing the sort of the bureaucratic interpretation of organizations. You know, we have a system of offices. Power belongs to the office, not to the individual, and there is a reporting structure through which we attempt to exercise control. It's quite a significant delusion in many cases, but that is how we choose to represent organizations. Following our last conversation, I wrote down that organization emerges from the process of the organization being. So although we have these things, and they're useful for, if you like, clarity of accountability, who owns what, who's responsible for what, they don't actually describe to us anything about how the organization actually works. Because how it works is it works at a process level where human beings interact despite the hierarchy very often, rather than because of it. And when we look at the functional organization that we typically see of sales and production and marketing and finance and HR and IT and so on, we spend an awful lot of our organizational time compensating for the stupidities of a functional organization by creating meetings and interactions through which we can communicate the things that are important. We might be better to say we need to push all that functional activity down into the control procedures of the organization, so that if I'm making a decision, then I'm bringing into that decision all of the insights that I need from all that functional capability in order to inform the decision, rather than having it as a separate functional input at a different hierarchical level.
Yeah, so I'm beginning to feel that this conversation will take us into what adaptive means fairly soon. But before we do that, you know, are you able to give a sort of natural world, small natural world example of a complex system in, you know, using some cybernetic language?
An anthill?
Sorry.
An anthill?
Oh, an anthill. Okay.
An ant colony, or a bee colony, a beehive. Why? They don't have the language of control and communication that we have in a sort of verbal sense. They are incredibly self-organizing. There is a hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy that emerges from the interaction of the members of the community. Each bee or each ant understands its role and its contribution to that community, but there are no orders given in the sense that we think about them in terms of our organizations, but they are controlled through natural processes, so that the behavior is more innate than instructed, shall we say, in the way that they interact. And you know, bees go off and do stuff. They go and collect, you know, nectar from plants, and they bring it back and they share it, and the whole mechanism works. That seems to work as a natural mechanism. So ecosystems in general, if we look at, and I'm looking out at the garden while we're talking, you know, we have a system that self-manages in the garden. It's, you know, the grass grows and the rain pours and the sunshine comes down, and the various creatures, whether they're insects or birds or hedgehogs, I think there's a hedgehog in the corner, do their own thing inside that ecosystem, so that the you know, if in terms of the food chain, the smallest animals provide food for the bigger animals, and so as we get that going on, we get what Pete Dudley called in a paper called Food for Trees, the system sustains itself by bringing in forms of energy, processing them, and excreting different forms of energy, and those different forms of energy get reinterpreted, reused by other entities within that ecosystem to sustain the environment as a whole. It's all self-organizing. It's possibly not efficient in human terms, but it is very effective in the sense that it keeps sustaining things. And if we or if there are changes in the external influences, if there is more rain or less rain, then the system responds to that by drying up or becoming waterlogged. So, you know, a garden that's a lawn this week that becomes a marsh next week will go from having, you know, birds on it to having tadpoles and frogs on it, because it's now a pond. It's adapted, and that the utility of the thing has changed because of the way it is now being used, because it has responded to its external environmental change. Does that work?
Yeah, I like the bees and ants. I think that's that's very helpful to me. And in my head, I mean, you've then used the word "it adapts." I think we better go and have a look at adaptive. But when you start to talk about adaptive, because I very much see adaptive as a, you know, as a something that's rather special to cybernetics, whereas complexity seems to be something that's used quite widely by people who look at systems, but I might be wrong. So as you talk about adaptive, can you just comment a little bit about, you know, how specific to cybernetics the ideas of complexity and adaptiveness are?
So you seeded the word adaptiveness in the previous question, so being a good cybernetician, my brain inevitably reflected it then in the answers that I gave.
Yeah,
so there's a cycle going on there where you know, by introducing an idea, I'm primed to be able to use it at the next opportunity, and consequently did so. And that, you know, but that's a really good example of a cybernetic process in action. You've stimulated something which has generated a response. So you're doing it at the level of the particular question you asked, but also you're doing it at the level of the language you chose to use to ask the question. So it was almost inevitable that I would use the word adaptive in the response because you flagged it. Okay, we get into a difficult area now. So we'll go with adaptiveness and the notion of adaptation first. About 20 years ago, there was a big movement around the notion of something that was called knowledge management. And that became quite big in organizations, it became quite big in the IT world. what a lot of knowledge management amounted to was codifying and storing data. When we look at the notion of learning, what we see is, again, and we see this very visibly in the education system, is that we teach people stuff and we test whether or not they've remembered that stuff at an examination time of some sort. When things go wrong in major systems, whenever there's a problem with the railway or an airport or a closed motorway, a minister appears and says, lessons will be learned. What that tends to mean is more reporting. When we think about adaptiveness, and in cybernetics, what we're concerned with is the ability of a system to pursue its end, pursue its goal. And it does that by using information about itself and its environment in order to change itself to reach a new state of balance. So adaptiveness is not just about acquiring new data, but about modifying the system in order to be able to respond to that data so that it behaves differently, but also perhaps about modifying the environment of the system to make it more amenable to the objectives of the organization. So we have two systems, both of them learning, as in acquiring new data, both of them adapting in terms of their structure or their process or their behavior in order to achieve. And so we end up with co-adaptation of the organization and its environment or the system, so that my beehive, my anthill also adapt to the changing conditions around them, but they also affect the conditions around them because of the things that they do.
Okay, and what you're describing there, if I understand it, is something adapting, but not being reliant on an intervention of some kind of leader or person in power to make that change or cause that adaptation. It adapts. The system adapts for itself, for its health and survival, and in so doing, your other point, it will impact the environment in which it is operating. It's not a in isolation system,
provided the conditions that it exists in enable that.
Explain that.
Well, I suppose all systems adapt. Some systems adapt more ably than others, and there may be conditions that, particularly in the environment, that inhibit adaptation. So what would that be? In human systems, it can be the bureaucracy being in charge that limits the ability of the organization to change. It may be behavioral. It might be that we all decide we don't want to adapt, we don't want to change, so we act to actually inhibit it rather than enable it. It may be that we'd like to be, I'd like to be a ballet dancer maybe, but I really don't have the physical form that makes it an appropriate set of activities. So it's never going to happen.
So that would be when we talk about working around the system, or finding someone who's willing to break the rules. That's what we're seeing there, that the system is not adapting there.
Yes. If you go back to Machiavelli, when was that, 1500 something, the interests of those, particularly in human systems, the interests of the powerful in any system act to control the interests of the less powerful in the same system. So people who are or think of themselves as being in charge can inhibit change in the system as long as it continues to support their objectives, and that's that you might see it in nature as well. So the big beasts are effectively in charge of the landscape. In nature, I guess they don't inhibit in quite the same way, but they can, and they manage the environment at some level. I'm trying to think the best way of expressing this. Systems self-organize. So, and they will self-organize in a context. So the context of the system conditions what can and cannot be done within it.
And when you say context there, you're talking about the kind of wider environment in which that system sits.
Yes.
But are you also talking about how well understood or how clear the purpose is within the system? Because presumably, a system that adapts but doesn't, by doing, fulfill its purpose more, is not adapting in a kind of a sensible or appropriate way.
There's a particular level at which a system acts to pursue its own survival. So the purpose of a system at one level is simply, and there's a quote from Stafford, the purpose of the system is to be itself. So the purpose of a tiger is to be a tiger, and it pursues being a tiger by eating things in its environment and by breeding, essentially. And there are a whole set of tiger-like behaviors that go with making that possible. The argument would be that with more richly sentient beings like human beings, we generate for ourselves a greater range of choices about the purposes to be fulfilled. But again, fundamentally, human beings exist to be human beings. When we join together in some form of organization, that organization has a purpose which is imputed by the people who make it exist. So we get together as an organization and we say our purpose is to create a series of discussions that will inform people about the nature of cybernetics. So we've chosen together to have a purpose and to create these conversations in order to try and fulfill it, and we'll reflect on the bits that work and don't work and try and adapt it so we do it better each time. But that purpose doesn't belong to me or you, it belongs to us as an organization, if you like, in this context. And it exists as a matter of our choice. So we could have chosen to talk about accounting or economics, or you could have chosen to talk about football. We'd have had a very different discussion. So there's levels to this, that the natural systems are purposeful in the sense of pursuing their own existence. Man-made systems, artificial systems, have purpose imputed to them by our observations or generated for them by our choices. So we're playing with some quite difficult ideas in those three levels.
And is this where, I mean, is cybernetics one of the, well, maybe the only approach that attempts to pull these concepts together and see how they interact?
I suppose systems theory in general would look at systems interaction, systems components. Some systems theories look more at human behavior, some look more at the behavior of machines and sort of technical systems. Cybernetics probably provides the best language and some of the best tools for articulating and understanding the processes that are going on, and it makes an assumption that systems are purposeful. So we use cybernetic language to describe the behavior of purposeful systems, which means we must have chosen or imputed a purpose to the system being observed. And one of the methodological challenges of a conversation about the cybernetics of an organization is actually getting an agreed description of what that purpose is. Because for an organization of 10 people, all 10 of them might have different interpretations of what it's there for. So to create the organizational coherence, to get a coalescence around a particular purpose, requires quite a rich dialogue, a rich understanding, a shared understanding to emerge between those people.
And John, I've always seen the adaptive part and the learning loops part as being kind of a very distinctive part of cybernetics in making that happen, that kind of creating that dynamism. I think last time you said that some people will just, describe systems as is, rather than seeing them having that dynamic nature. So am I right that that's a really distinctive part, or is that just my prejudice or my closeness to you that causes me to see it like that?
At any given point in time, the observer of a system generates a description. And that would include, for me as a cybernetician, describing the feedback loops, the control loops that I think describe the way that that system is behaving. So that, if you like, forces the generation of a particular structure at that point in time. Whether it was right yesterday, whether it would be right tomorrow, are different matters. But you have two things that are going on again inside the system. You have structural variation, where the structure of conversation, the structure of process is itself changing, although probably at a slower rate. But then you have the dynamic information that is flowing through the system, the conversation we're actually having, and that's changing at a faster rate. So in our car factory, to go to sort of basic stuff, our car factory is designed to produce Toyota Corollas, and it's designed to produce X thousand of them a year. And it has a particular structure, a particular form, a particular way of being organized in order to fulfill its purpose of making Toyota Corollas. And that will be relatively stable for a relatively sustainable period of time, or a very long period of time. The information about each Toyota Corolla going down the production line is much more highly dynamic, because each one will have a particular set of seats, a particular set of wheels, particular color scheme, etc. And that's all sort of programmable into a big system. It will produce, the factory as designed will produce X number of cars. Sitting over the top of that is Charlie and Fred and Mabel and Catherine coming into work this morning with whatever their mood happens to be for the day. And that will have an influence on how they do the job that they're brought in to do. So what characteristic, what aspect of this is it we're trying to describe? And it's relatively easy, and this may be the trap we all fall into, it's relatively easy to describe the long-term production process for manufacturing motor cars. It's relatively easy to describe the just-in-time process that gets the components there on time. It's much, much harder to deal with human beings who maybe had a car accident on their way to work this morning, or the boiler broke when they thought they were going to have a shower, or they're dissatisfied because they don't feel they have control over the work that's in front of them, because it's dictated by the structure of the production line and how they then interact with it. So we've got all those things going on in parallel within that rich conversation.
And what about me then? Because I'm running this factory and I don't want Corollas anymore. So I've decided we're going to change the car we manufacture, or maybe I'm even more foresighted and I think we don't want cars anymore. We need to, change the system to produce something else that's going to be more relevant in 30 or 40 years.
So now we get into a real control problem. For any system that we have delineated, any system that we've sort of put down on a bit of paper and said, this is the system, this is the car factory. That car factory will probably be a contained system in some higher order system of ownership. So actually, as the manager of the car factory, you may not have the freedom, the autonomy to change it from a car factory to a bicycle factory. That decision may not be in your gift, so it may belong to somebody else. So there's there's a hierarchy of control that emerges, and I describe it as emerging. It might be represented as an organisation chart in the traditional way. I would prefer to see it, and cybernetics would certainly see it, as an informational hierarchy. You don't, as a position of factory manager, necessarily have the information you need in order to be able to make that decision competently, and you may not have been granted authority by the organisation, i.e. it may not have delegated to you power to do so. It might have done, but it seems unlikely. Mm-hmm. So the organisation as a whole has a hierarchy that says certain powers are reserved to certain people or positions within that structure. Natural systems, the anthill has that to a degree. It has a queen, or whatever it is. Anthills have beehives have queens, and the natural order that exists within the beehive creates that structure around how each of the bees behaves in order to contribute to the bee colony. When we look at human systems, we again come back to choice, and we come back to who has what information and what freedoms in order to be able to change the system. So the cybernetics would argue that we need to manage the autonomy of the individuals within the system, and we need to engage people in a conversation about how much autonomy is enough at any given level. And that's then informed by and informs the control loops, as you described in the feedback loops, that we use in order to manage things. So I might say to you as factory manager, you might pass a message up to me as the chief executive of Carco and say, actually, I think we should stop making petrol engines, we should start making battery engine, battery powered vehicles. And I can say, that's very interesting, Chris, yes, please do get on with it. Have you got one in mind? Or I can say, yes, we're dealing with that, but we're dealing with it over here in another part of the system, because where you are, you may not be aware of that other part of the system, which is already exercising the idea that you've talked about. So the hierarchy gives us a position of a different view of the world, if you like, as we work through that organizational framework. What you can do at your control level is make better cars, make them more consistently, make them more coherently, but we may not have given you the freedom to not make them at all. In our system, in the Western democracies, you can, of course, choose not to work there. You can choose to go and work in a bicycle factory somewhere else, but you may not have the freedom to turn my car factory into your bicycle factory.
But that's really interesting. So, but that's all part of the feedback loop, isn't it? So the fact that people stop buying cars, that's feedback that says we don't want Corollas anymore. The fact that people go and work elsewhere might be because the conditions are poor, or they don't think it's a factory that's going to survive very long, so it doesn't fit with their own personal needs. So you've got all sorts of different loops that are impacting, on the how long this system is going to survive and stick with its purpose. Is that?
And that's massively important. So what we've got on our production line will have control systems in place which operate on feedback loops. So I wanted to paint it red. Did I paint it red? Yes or no? And it has an information flow coming in that says, and the next one's got to be blue, and the one after that silver, and so on. So we can see that production process in operation. We feed it with the information, and we have a feedback process on top of that process that says, yes, but the red wasn't quite right, or the paint finish isn't good, or we've missed a bit. And they have a rectification process which relies on feedback information about the quality of the work that was done in order to both improve the next one and correct anything we've done this time. And that's very sort of formal and mechanistic. When you come to but how does Fred feel about how the J went today? Is Fred happy about building cars with internal combustion engines or not? We're into the psychological feedback loops, the behavioral stuff that's saying, how do I feel about me? How do I feel about the contribution I'm making to this? Am I happy that I'm doing the job as well as I can? So could I do the job better? But also, as an individual, is this what I want to do, or do I want to do something else? So you've got all that going on at the individual level. And I suppose one of the challenges of management, and I mean management as opposed to administration, is the maintenance of the alignment of the values of the organization and the values of the people that work in it. And again, that's a conversation about two things. It's about, are we behaving authentically in line with the values that we espouse as an organization? So are people happy working here? Have we created conditions that make it a good place to be? We've also got a conversation which is more anticipatory or feed forward about what sort of organization do we want to be in the future? So we have to start thinking about, particularly where people are involved, not just about what sort of cars might we want to make in the future, but what sort of organization might we want to be in the future, and what sort of behaviors and values do we want to see in ourselves and in the people that we work with.
So when you talk about values there, because last time you talked about identity a bit, is that the same thing?
It's a different word, if that helps.
That's what I'm trying to get clarified. So
I think our identity, in the sense of who we are, is a function of the values that we bring to the decisions that we make. So identity emerges from our values. It's the way we people choose, or we may choose to characterize ourselves, or others may characterize us, and talk about, you know, caring or supportive or loving or friendly or aggressive, or, and, you know, those are characteristics of our identity.
So very simply, values is what I might have inside, but identity would be how others would see or perceive it.
It's part of identity is partly about how I choose to present myself to you, and then there's how you choose to observe what I'm presenting. And I think what we're all looking for there is consistency at the human level of a sort of, you say this, you do that. Those two things are not consistent with each other. So actually, my interpretation of your identity is we'll be polite and say you're confused. When we come to an organisation, which is an entity separate from but emerging from the individuals that make it up, we're making choices to have a purpose, and our purpose and our identity then become similar. So we're choosing to articulate ourselves to the world. So we need to imbue the organisation with a set of values that enable that purpose to be fulfilled, and that purpose has to be consistent with the set of beliefs that we've brought to it. And where that doesn't happen, we see very rapidly, we see lack of authenticity, lack of integrity in those things. And you know, I mean, I always get twitchy when I look at a company that says, yeah, about itself, yeah, do no evil. And we won't mention who that is, but they're quite big on the internet, because they're articulating something which is actually probably impossible to live with, and impossible to sustain as a global entity. And it makes you think, well, what do they think they mean by evil?
Let's go back to your factory, because I think it's quite interesting, this factory. So, because I just want to, so at the level of the kind of production line, I can see that, you know, lots of feedback loops will improve the way in which, you know, the efficiency of that, and it will probably improve the, you know, decrease the cost. So you can kind of see that the purpose is to produce cars of a certain quality at a certain price within that system, and you get loops that, you know, minimize the waste and so on and so forth. And that's, you know, am I getting that right?
Yeah.
At a much higher level in that organization system, they might want to continue employing 100,000 people and making certain amounts of money and impact on the world, or whatever it is that they define their purpose of as an organization, which could lead to decisions being made in the loop there about different cars or different products. That's
yeah.
When you, are they the different levels of recursion there going on within an organization? Is that what you mean when you talk about that in cybernetics, or not?
So recursion is a mathematical term that I won't even try and explain, because I'm not sure I could. Oh. Conceptually, in the way that we use it in cybernetics, and particularly when we're talking about organizational cybernetics, it's suggesting that there is a structural invariance between levels of a system, so that each system has something that it does that's of value, a mechanism for managing its present, a mechanism for creating its future, and a mechanism for resolving the tension between the present and the future. So at any notional level of organization, those characteristics will exist. And if they don't exist, the entity itself becomes unviable. It becomes incapable of the adaptation that's required to ensure its sustainability. When we look at then a large organization, large-scale organization, we go from being me to me and you to being us, and us is a higher order organization than either me or you, and it exists to enable us to fulfill a particular purpose. And we have a control conversation going on, which is about, how did we do last time? So are we managing our present? Are we doing the things that we said we wanted to do? And because we're intelligent cyberneticians, we've reflected on, are we creating the future we want to create? Are we inventing the things that we need for tomorrow? And we're consulting our environment. We've gone out to a group of people to reflect on the work we did last time and say, this is the question we thought we were asking. Did we ask it? Did we answer it? How might we adapt what we're doing to fulfill that need more accurately? So we've got, so I'm thinking about, am I doing what I said I was going to do? Am I delivering the things I said I would? What do we want to do next? Am I being honest? Am I showing integrity? Am I being authentic in the conversation we're having? You're doing exactly that on your own, but we are then looking at the artifact that we're creating and having precisely the same conversation. So in this particular stack of systems, and it probably is a stack, the structure of the us conversation is precisely the same as the structure of the individual conversations, but the individual elements of the conversation might well be different. So we have my language, your language, and our language. And our language is an emergent property of the two individual conversations. So we've created structural invariance through a hierarchy in which it is possible to then make certain decisions at certain levels, but in a consistent manner. So when you then scale that up to a whole organization, you might have a motor car manufacturer that might have, what do they call it? They call it tact time. So structurally, they have elements of a production process, each of which will have a set of constraints that it operates within, a time limit, a physical space, a distance, a whole bunch of characteristics, and a team of people that deliver it. And the production line will be made up of 10, 20, 50, 60, 70 of those, contained within a car factory, well, actually probably contained within a shift, and a shift will have a set of objectives. And then the day will have a set of objectives, and the week, and the factory, and the year. So we build up, and each of those things is structurally doing the same stuff. Did we do what we said we were going to do? And what should we do next? Are we doing it consistently and authentically? And that applies then all the way up to whoever's the big cheese at the top of this car organization that says, yes, Chris, that's a good idea, but we're doing it over here.
So it's very interesting. I mean, we've probably not got that long left today, but you said to me about having feed forward as well as feedback loops, and I can't resist asking you to tell me what feed forward loops are. So
feedback, as used in cybernetics, as opposed to as used in HR. Feedback, any cybernetic system is designed to self-regulate. So it uses information about its performance to adapt itself, back to that word again, so that the next cycle of operation, it becomes closer to achieving its set target. And that feedback loop might be negative, it might reduce difference, or it might be positive, it might amplify difference. So we have that going. So feedback is an attempt to regulate and control. Feed forward is an attempt to anticipate. So when we're thinking about feed forward control, what we're trying to do then is think about using information to create conditions that will suit where we're going to be as opposed to where we are. So we're starting to look at the future and say, if this is our purpose, if these are the things that we exist to try and achieve, what conditions do we need to create to make that possible? So we're anticipating things and almost preempting things. Some of the best examples of this exist at a very fundamental level. So the fire service in the UK is funded primarily on a preventative basis. So we fund our fire service to inhibit the risk of fires and the other fire and rescue these days, the other things that they deal with. Whereas our prison service, by contrast, is a reactive controlling process. So by thinking about prevention, we're anticipating the things that might happen and taking actions now to avoid them. So if we equip houses with fire alarms, if we use better insulation on our switches, if we use better earthing, we will get less house fires. If we use non-combustible materials, when we do get a house fire, it won't be as big an issue. Whereas feedback can only control what has already happened. Feed forward is attempting to understand what could happen and damp variation in that world. It might be used deliberately to create opportunity. So in organizational terms, marketing is much more about feed forward than it is about feedback, because actually what we're trying to do is modify the environment of the organization to make it more suited to the things that we think we want to do.
And do you see it as a human organizational concept, or can you observe it in the natural world, the idea of feed forward and predicting what's going to happen?
Squirrels put nuts away during the summer to eat during the winter. Polar bears feed themselves up so they can go and hide in a pile of snow for months and bear children without actually, or bear cubs without having to feed in the meanwhile. So we can see anticipatory feed forward behaviors happening in the natural world in a very sort of substantial way, because the behavior of animals says we anticipate, however, whatever language they use to describe seasons, they anticipate a point coming when they won't be able to eat.
No, that's really interesting. They must have learned it at some point in the past before they were extinct. So
yes,
in that sense, they must have seen the problem and adapted, mustn't they, before they were all gone?
Yes, and at a higher level, we breed, whether as human beings or as animals. There's a creation of a next generation as a sort of genetic, what appears to be a genetic imperative. It says, we actually, Dawkins would probably argue we're just breeding machines. We only exist to propagate our genes into the next generation. It would be a sort of a simplification of Dawkins' view. But again, it is a preemptive feed forward activity. We can see certainly in human systems, historically, perhaps even now, where choice is exercised around the number of children that people have. And part of that is informed by the way that their particular society functions and the need for, or the lack of need for, children in that society. There's almost a utility value associated to some extent. If you want to do farming, you need labour to do farming. So where do you get employees? And one of the ways of doing that is you have more children. In the Western world, we now employ people. But actually what we're trying to do is all the time is create a sustainable environment for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, we might have another conversation at some point about how we forget and don't, retain that learning and repeat errors as human beings of the past historically. But maybe that's not for today.
But again, it's probably not for today. It's almost certainly about choice.
Yeah,
and how we exercise it.
So what I'm hearing today, and you may wish to kind of comment after I've done this little bit, just to kind of put it together a bit, John. But what I'm really hearing, because when I've probed you about cybernetics, what I'm getting is that cybernetics gives us the language to describe and understand these systems and the kind of concepts we've explored today. So complexity and adaptiveness and purposefulness and feedback loops. They kind of, what cybernetics allows us to do is describe how all those things kind of interact in what in itself is a very kind of complex way. But I think what you're saying is that cybernetics gives us the language and the framework to try and understand and see how those systems are functioning, and therefore how they will evolve and adapt. That's what I'm getting from this, rather than any of those concepts being distinctively and only cybernetic concepts.
Again, if you go back to Plato, he used the language of the notion of the steersman to describe political process in ancient Greece. If you look at information theory, you can see cybernetic characteristics in that. So I think what I am saying is that the language of cybernetics does provide us with that ability to describe the behavior of complex adaptive systems. Whether they're natural or man-made, in that sense, doesn't matter. It is a language that lets us probe into each of those areas and describe it using that language. And the utility of the thinking is in understanding that that's a mechanism by which we can describe what's happening. It's also a mechanism by which we can intervene in what is happening through that understanding. The information theory and the communications theory that underpin some of this, and the use of things like mobile phones and the sort of technologies we now employ, are critical parts of that cybernetic understanding, but they're essentially doing the same thing. They're formal methods for characterizing things like feedback and feed forward and anticipatory control. The complexity of the system, nothing else comes at it for me with the ability to give quite the same clarity of understanding and clarity of description. But what we can find is in any discipline we look into, we will find echoes both of the language and of the understanding. And what the cybernetics lets us do is lift beyond or above the particular discipline and describe things from a supradisciplinary perspective. So that we can look into biology, we can look into chemistry, we can look into a beehive, and we can look into a car factory, and we can use essentially the same language to describe the observable behaviors of adaptive systems running on feedback. So I think that means yes.
and maybe it's slightly ironic that these conversations are an attempt to make some of that language a bit more accessible. And I suspect that we might return to some of those big concepts in subsequent conversations, but certainly we will probably look at some of the phrases and words that are used that maybe have kept this cybernetic thinking rather hidden away and harder to access. And maybe next time that's what we're going to start to tackle, some of the language and things that get in the way and prevent people from using cybernetics more routinely. So, John, I think for now that's thanks very much, and I hope you've all enjoyed.
Thanks a lot, Chris. We'll speak very shortly.
Bye-bye.